sort of writing long obituaries of democracy and explaining to us why and how democracies die. And of course, these have been occasioned by the emergence and sweep of right-wing populist regimes across the world, which has had the effect of destabilizing and even, I would say, delegitimizing democracy as we have known it, that is representative democracy, which with all its imperfections did manage to mediate in some way between citizens and states. And so in this rather grim context, it's hugely reassuring for someone like me to read Jennifer Bussel's book, Clients and Constituents, which shows us how, even in the context of just patronage democracy, service by politicians actually does help a certain kind of democracy to work. Before I go any further, let me say that the intellectual property for this term, patronage democracy, belongs, of course, to my friend Kanchan Chandra here, and I hope she claims it and earns royalties on it. Anyway, in my view, this book makes a significant contribution on two quite distinct levels. Firstly, it challenges the common assumption that politicians, forgive me, Shashi, are entirely self-serving, with a propensity to neglect their constituencies. I'm sure you're not one of them. And according to Jennifer's book, there are many others like you. So constituency service, as Jennifer argues, actually helps patronage democracy to work. Secondly, I think the book marks a valuable beginning in helping us to think through the possible normative implications of constituency service and how we might think about it normatively in terms of its implications for theories of representation and theories of accountability. So I'll say a couple of words about each of these contributions before I turn it over to Jennifer to discuss the book at greater length. Now, as Kanchan's work on patronage democracies has shown us, the discretionary nature of public services delivery is something that we are all aware of. And this is frequently, not entirely, but frequently due to partisan linkages which either help services to be provided or to be blocked. And this book, Jennifer's book, shows us that the assistance provided by high-level politicians, members of parliament and members of legislative assemblies, is largely non-contingent and non-partisan. That is, regardless of whether the person seeking assistance is a co-partisan of the politician from whom she or he is seeking assistance, regardless of whether that individual has given this politician electoral support in the past, there is a strong likelihood that the politician would in fact help this individual. Partly because politicians are looking to persuade uncommitted voters, or perhaps because they have an incentive to solicit votes for themselves, not just for the parties to which they belong. Now, of course, there's a lot more to this argument. It's very complex and very nuanced, and I will leave that to Jennifer to develop. But the second contribution is in how Jennifer teases out the normative implications of her essentially empirical study of constituency service, which she interprets as expanding the standard idea of representation and the rather limited expectations we typically have of it as a form of distributive politics and even as a form of accountability. Now, she acknowledges that representational inequalities are likely to persist, as her own study shows with women and members of the scheduled tribes, that the distributional effects are not necessarily egalitarian, and that such forms of accountability are individuated and therefore may not be accessible to all constituents. Indeed, one could argue, or at least I would argue, I don't know if Jennifer would agree, that this type of limited or what you call constrained accountability could actually serve to entrench patronage, highlighting patronage democracy more deeply. Yeah. So what we have here is a nuanced interpretation, fully cognizant of the fact that what is normatively acceptable in the context of a patronage democracy may be less than morally appealing in the context of a more full-blooded notion of democracy. But in the contemporary moment, with democracy having become an embattled idea, so prone to manipulation, so prone to cynical appropriation, this, I think, is a valuable intervention. So I'm going to invite Jennifer now to present the argument of her book, but I'm going to encourage her also to dwell a little bit on the methodological ambitions of her study, the shadowing of politicians, the online survey, the citizen survey, the interviews with fixers and brokers at the local level, and also her analysis of constituency development funds, all of which I think add up to a really interesting story. So Jennifer, 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Ashu, for inviting me to be here and for helping to bring this book to print, and to everyone at OUP who also participated in that venture and who have put on such a fantastic event today. It's a lot of work behind the scenes, and we're all very grateful to you for all of that work. So, in the preface of this book, I recount an experience that really motivated the entire 6 or 7 years that it took for me to get this out. And this was in the fieldwork for the final stages of my first book, which was a book on e-governance and reform in India. And in those final stages, one of the things that I was doing was conducting some interviews with government officials, in particular politicians, who had played a role in e-governance reforms. And so I went to the house of a former minister in Karnataka, and as I approached the house, I noted that there were more than 100 people lined up outside of his door waiting to see him. And so I said to, I had spent much more of my time in my research for this book interviewing bureaucrats who also tended to have people waiting to see them, but maybe not 100 or more people waiting to see them. And so I said to my friend who was going with me, what's happening here? Why are all of these people here? And he said simply, they all want the MLA's help getting something from the state. And so this raised a number of questions in my mind. First of all, for what had these individuals come to ask the MLA for assistance? Who were they, the people who were making these kinds of requests? Why were they approaching a relatively high-level legislator, someone at the state level, rather than someone who probably lived closer to them, who maybe had a different kind of control over resources in their city council district or in a rural area? Was this a rare case? Was this a very specific and particular politician? Or is this something that was happening at legislators' offices and homes across the country? And if it was the latter, then to what extent did politicians actually help citizens in getting the things that they came asking for assistance? And then finally, how did the answer to these questions square with existing accounts, particularly in political science, of political representation and distributive politics in India and elsewhere? And so then, as I said, I spent the next multiple years trying to answer these questions, some of which I deal with perhaps better than others in the book, but the result of that work is what we'll be discussing today. So what I observed on this day in particular, and in subsequent visits across multiple parts of India, was particularly surprising to me from the perspective of comparative politics, because we've previously expected politicians in places that we might consider patronage democracies per Conscien's description and conceptualization, to engage with citizens either through what we understand as partisan bias or through what we might alternatively think of as clientelism. So in other words, we would expect these politicians either to target large projects, roads, building infrastructure, wells, to areas in the constituency that they know supported them in previous elections, or, and that is what I would refer to as partisan bias, or we would expect them to delegate distributive politics to local actors, people who can help allocate scarce goods and benefits to those individuals who have supported the politician or party in the past in a form of a quid pro quo relationship, or what we often describe as clientelism. So instead, what I argue in this book is that politicians in India very frequently receive requests from individual citizens for assistance, that they typically respond to these requests, and more often than not, they do so without regard to whether or not that is someone who has voted for them or is their co-partisan. In short, Politicians are providing what we understand in other contexts to be constituency service, or service that is provided without attention to the race, caste, gender, or political preferences of an individual, or the history of their political support. So, the question then is, why in the world would politicians spend their time doing this? Especially politicians with constituencies that are at a minimum of 200,000 people, where they have very little ability to know all of their constituents or respond to probably all of these requests. And I suggest that to answer this question, we have to give attention both to the demand for this assistance and the characteristics of its supply. So first, it's well established that many individuals in India continue to have difficulty accessing benefits from the state, and this leads to a well-established in the literature demand for intermediation. This is intermediation from actors who have greater information about or power over distribution than the average individual. And as existing work shows, and as I additionally show in this book, the most common sources of assistance are local actors. They are panchayat presidents in particular. Yet there's also considerable evidence that these actors privilege those individuals who support them or have supported them in past elections. What this means to me, and what I think has not been addressed in existing work, however, is that there are citizens whose needs will go unmet at the local level. And I argue that rather than giving up on these things that they truly require from the state, and to which they are often entitled, they will instead look for alternative paths to accessing these resources, alternative forms of assistance, and that their political representatives, often the member of the Legislative Assembly for their district or their member of parliament, will be appealing intermediaries both because they have the power that they can exercise over the distribution of these resources, and they often have the incentive to do so. So the question then is, why do they have this incentive? Where is the incentive for the supply of this assistance? So from the perspective of MLAs, and I think to a lesser extent, though we'll hear more about that later, MPs, there are multiple electoral reasons why legislators might want to provide assistance. Now the first is familiar to us in terms of thinking about democracy in other locations, and representative democracy in particular, and that is that politicians can use this kind of individual interaction with a citizen to build what we described as a personal vote. Now a personal vote is the portion of a politician's support base that is attributable to their own behavior, to their individual relationship with citizens, and not to their political party. And perhaps we can talk more in the Q&A about why that's particularly important in the Indian case. Now, this effect, I would argue, might even be magnified in a place like India, because if people are being blocked from assistance at the local level, they may be even more responsive and appreciative of receiving assistance from someone else later, who then they might think about voting for in the future. Perhaps more surprisingly, and in contrast with existing expectations, politicians in India may also have greater incentives than those in what we might describe as more programmatic contexts to provide assistance, because they have some understanding of the local partisan dynamics that I've just described. So if a politician can make inferences about the types of individuals who are coming to him or her to request assistance, because they know that someone at the local level has probably blocked this person from assistance, and that means that that local person is either someone who is not the party of this higher level politician, or the person making the request is a swing voter, this suggests that even if they cannot identify the political inclinations of the person making the request, it is highly likely that that is someone who either may already support them or who might be more willing to support them in the future. So this increases, even in a context where we wouldn't necessarily think politicians would find incentives to provide this kind of assistance, it may increase the degree to which politicians would find this appealing over more, less patronage democracy types of locations. Now critically, while we might expect the incentives for constituency service then to be infrequent in a place like India, I actually think that these characteristics of local partisan allocation increase and magnify the demands for constituency service at higher levels of government. Now, this doesn't mean, by any means, that politicians will always offer nonpartisan assistance, and this is a key part of the discussion and evidence base in the book. What I argue instead is that they will develop portfolios of distribution that utilize constituency service, partisan bias, and clientelism to differing degrees at different moments in time and under differing circumstances. So specifically, politicians will often prefer constituency service over clientelism when they have little control over the local intermediaries in their area, and so they cannot ensure that their co-partisans will be receiving benefits locally, or because the local actors prefer to target their own supporters rather than those of the MLA. With regard to partisan bias, constituency service should be particularly appealing when politicians have little ability to identify the identity or partisanship of the individual making a request, and when the provision of assistance is relatively easy on their part. So this is specifically the case when an individual is making a request for a very basic benefit or help accessing a service that they can do very quickly and without that much cost to them, versus when someone comes to ask for something that might require them to use their MLA Lads Fund or MP Lads Fund, and when they would be able to take time to identify where the location is for the request that's being made, whether or not the polling station in that location provides evidence of whether or not this area has voted for them in the past, what have you. So I provide empirical evidence for this set of theoretical claims using, as was already noted, a variety of qualitative and quantitative data from across India. And I think there will be some commentary perhaps later about the differing strengths and weaknesses of these different forms of data collection. But for me, a big part of this project was trying to understand the conditions under which a certain kind of data or evidence would provide leverage on a certain piece or part of the argument, and recognizing when it wouldn't. And so taking qualitative data and interviews and shadowing into account where I thought it would be useful, and then also using larger survey-based or experimental techniques to test things that I think couldn't really be identified in a purely observational setting. So this includes multi-day shadowing of MLAs and panchayat presidents in multiple states, interviews with politicians, large-scale surveys of politicians, citizens, and bureaucrats in nested constituencies, analysis of administrative data on resource allocation, in particular analysis of the use of MLA Lads funds in Karnataka, and field and survey experiments on politician responsiveness. Now, what did I find? Well, among other things, I found first that state legislators do spend considerable time attending to individual citizen requests. And to quantify this to a certain extent, I would argue that they spend about a quarter of their time in the constituency dealing with individual requests from citizens. Now, as the book shows, this is a bit less time on average than a typical village level president might spend. They allocate on average about a third of their time to individual requests. But I think this is still a substantial allocation of politician resources, particularly given the increased set of requirements and responsibilities at higher levels of government. Second, the individuals who are making these requests to MLAs and MPs are substantially more likely to be those who do not share the partisanship of their local panchayat president. So in other words, it is those citizens who are more likely to be blocked from access to assistance at the local level who look up the political hierarchy for assistance from other actors. Finally, the assistance that politicians do provide is largely what I describe as constituency service. In a large field experiment with nearly all of India's state and national legislators, I found that politicians did not respond to information on an individual's political party or past voting behavior, and instead responded equally to politicians across all political backgrounds. And I'm continuing to do work to explore further dimensions of variation across race, caste, and religion in the relationship between politicians and petitioners. So politicians in India do target benefits to their supporters, but they also provide assistance to individual citizens via constituency service. Now, as it was already raised, there are at the same time, I think, very important potential downsides to this dynamic, and I hope that we will have time to consider some of those issues as a part of the discussion. But what I'm going to do now is end my commentary, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Since we have a politician in our midst, I think the other day to have had one, it seems logical, given the theme of Jennifer's book, to ask you to comment on whether these findings resonate with your own experiences.
Thank you very much, Deja. In fact, it's particularly relevant for two reasons, which is that I found myself on a totally different forum commenting on Jennifer's first book, the corruption one, and now I find myself under OUP auspices commenting on a second book. So clearly there is a recurrent pattern here, and the third book too, I'm sure I will have a chance to read and react to. It's becoming a habit. But what, as I told Jennifer today, what particularly makes it relevant is the fact that I actually wrote an article. It summarizes the thesis of Jennifer's book from my own experiences. And so it may be of interest to all of you who want to pursue this topic further. If you were to Google ThePrint and my name and constituent services, I think you'll find it. And I also developed this concern of mine about how our parliamentary system in many ways is failing our democracy by addressing it as part of a much larger theme in an essay called The Crisis of Representation in Open magazine year and a half or so ago, and I would urge that too to serious scholars of Indian politics who want a practitioner's view. But having said that, we've all listened to Jennifer. There's no need for me to repeat that. She's done a very interesting job on the relationship between politicians and citizens in a country like ours, where the state is a major welfare provider, and the distribution of benefits is often discretionary and definitely inefficient. And her argument that we treat citizens as constituents and spend a substantial portion of our time helping individuals to navigate the state and access public services is absolutely spot on as far as my experience is concerned. In fact, I've often talked about this, and one example that came to mind is now some years ago, but I remember it vividly because I remember the old gentleman vividly. He was weeping when I approached him. There was a throng of people who'd come to my home. And I'd seen him for years at party gatherings, a very distinguished-looking figure, erect in his late 70s or early 80s then, in a neat white or beige jubba, short kurta, always carrying a furled umbrella. He'd apparently been a freedom fighter as a teenager and was still kicking. There's a few of them still around. And he usually had a very friendly smile for me. But today's expression was somber, almost grieving. What's the matter, I asked, and he broke down. For a year, he said, I've asked your staff to get my grandson a job at the Technopark, and they've done nothing for me. What's the point of having been a Swatantra Senani, a freedom fighter, and making so many sacrifices for the party if you can't even do this for me? So I called my staff over and demanded an explanation. It turned out the boy was a humanities student, and a poor one at that, who had failed to get admission to an LLB program. And Thiruvananthapuram's Technopark, which is a hub of IT and software development and business process outsourcing companies, had no use for him. But the old man was disconsolate. And he says, my son says that he has no choice but to try his luck outside. He's already gone outside the state. I'll have no option to commit suicide. And my grandson also leaves Kerala, but he won't be there to light my pyre. So what fate will my soul face in my afterlife? That was his story. So I looked at him with compassion, told him to stay strong, thanked him for his services to the party, and promised him he would try something with another company, but not in the Technopark. And he wasn't buying it. He said, one phone call from an MP, and this will get done in half an hour. But you all won't do this for an old freedom fighter. Now, how does one explain to an old gentleman, struggling with his emotions and the attendant loss of dignity, that no company these days would hire an unsuitable candidate merely because of a call from an MP or even a minister? I think I was a minister at the time he came to me. How does one explain that the reward for being a freedom fighter is freedom, but not necessarily jobs for his grandson? How does one explain that loyalty to an MP's party does not automatically entitle one's family members to out-of-turn privileges that they don't deserve on merit? And what does it say about the statism, Sifarish culture and mutual favor-mongering that infects the political system we have built, that an MP's work should be judged on his ability or otherwise to deliver such favors and not by what he does in the parliament of which he's been elected to be a member? So that this is the case above any other yardstick became apparent to me soon after my election. So at the Meet the Public sessions that I hold regularly in the MP's office, and now increasingly at my residence, because people have decided to break through the barriers of home and residence. This is our equivalent of what the British MPs call surgeries. And for a British MP on a busy day, according to MPs I've spoken to in Britain, they might see 6 or 7 constituents on a really busy day of surgeries. I see some 250 on a light day, and very often more than that. And they're all bearing petitions, grievances, requests, complaints that they expect me to resolve. 95% of these relate to personal favors, requests for jobs, transfers, and regularizations of temporary positions to permanent ones being the most common. Each time there are at least 30 people bearing letters that are summoning their sons or daughters for a job interview who want the MP to put in a word for them to the agency or authority. It's almost always a governmental or private sector body, often a bank, sometimes very rarely a private sector body, ahead of the interview. At least 25 will be carrying letters on behalf of constituents serving with the paramilitary forces. Kerala is disproportionately represented in the armed services and the paramilitary, and so BSF, CRPF, and the rest. And these are usually Keralites who've been assigned to Nagaland, the Naxalite-infested areas in Chhattisgarh, Kashmir, and they all suddenly seem to have aged fathers, ailing mothers, pregnant wives, clamoring for them to be transferred on compassionate grounds to Kerala. And you can fully understand this, but after a while your own credibility starts suffering. There are also dozens of people who've been appointed to temporary positions or a series of short-term contracts who after many years feel entitled to the security benefits and pension possibilities of regular posts for which they are not, under the terms of contract, eligible. Now, the next most common request in a state that values education, which is what Kerala does, is for admission to a good school or college, but it's almost always of a kid who doesn't otherwise qualify. Then there are assorted people looking for financial assistance, for education, for a child's marriage, for home repairs, to help pay off loans, and above all, to cope with illness. Of that last category, major cases requiring surgery can be referred to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund, the Health Minister's Rashtriya Arogya Nidhi, or the Chief Minister's Distress Relief Fund, though under the present government and the state that fund isn't functioning. But some who've exhausted those possibilities or are ineligible for them because they don't need surgery, they need money for medicines and so on, those I try and help myself by doling out small sums through a foundation that I have established for the purpose in my late father's name, and which I put my own money into because I don't want to be accused of raising any money from anybody for a charitable purpose, so it remains genuinely charitable. But I send no one away with a negative response, because that was what I was advised very early in my very first such session, before I even had an office established in Trivandrum, soon after being elected, was I frankly expressed my inability to help people with one or two outlandish requests very early in my career. And at that point, a shocked party worker told me, "No politician says no to a constituent. You may think his request is improper or unfeasible or even, illegal. Doesn't matter. You are his MP. It is your duty to say yes and do whatever you can to help him. He may not get his wish, but at least you will have tried." A frequent example that was often cited to me was of the time a popular Chief Minister of Kerala was approached by a constituent requesting a letter to President Bill Clinton at that time for some absurd purpose. Totally unfeasible. Now, while a lesser mortal like me might have hesitated, indeed might have refused, knowing that I would make a fool of myself by signing such a letter, our heroic CM gladly obliged. He must have reasoned that Clinton would never read the letter, but even if he did, what Clinton might think of him mattered much less to the CM than the gratitude of the constituent. That is the principle. Now, this is all far removed from what I had naively imagined I would be spending my time on when I entered politics. Policy issues, development challenges crop up very rarely. Most of an MP's time is spent on constituent services, which means basically doing favors for voters. I tell myself that retail politics is a means to an end, to preserve the viability that allows an MP to make a bigger impact on the national stage. But the realization that the issues I care about are not what voters care about does give me pause. It's a very troubling concern. After all, Jennifer actually spent some time in her book looking at the policy implications of the problems constituents bring. So what is the policy implication? That there is a scarcity of jobs? Create more jobs. We know that anyway. But no individual MP is going to be able to create jobs. He's going to be one more voice in a clamor of voices in our society calling for more jobs. What do you do about people not being able to afford to pay their loans? You know, if you're in government, you can waive some loans, but some, should you? What about the moral hazard of that? So now, Jennifer makes a couple of very important points about citizens often needing help in getting benefits, and that is true, actually. That very often, the bureaucracy is impenetrable or opaque, and if you don't have somebody with more energy than you, with prior experience of doing it, who knows whom to call, which door to bang on, you as an ordinary citizen are bound to suffer. So that's an important role. And she says there's existing scholarly work which suggests that high-level politicians, state or national legislators, MLAs and MPs, offer little assistance to individual citizens. I don't know who these scholars are. They don't know the first thing about Indian politics. Because, or apparently, according to Jennifer, summary, they only help people who voted for them. Impossible. How can you tell who voted for you or not? And even if you ask, they'll lie to you. You know, you will always discover there are more people who claim to have voted for you than actually did. That's part of the course. I mean, that's, you know, you just accept that and par for the course, and you do it. So the fact is that no one is selective. Anybody who comes, and very often, frankly, people come with requests that you will oblige, and often by obliging them, you're losing a voter because the person's getting a job somewhere else or a visa to a foreign country. And that's one thing that I am often asked a lot for, is to help people who've been rejected for visas to foreign countries. And you know, sometimes, I don't do it in every single case, but sometimes, especially when the constituent seems sort of desperately in need of help, I often do go to ambassadors and high commissioners I know and get them that help. And that theoretically ought to help, but many of these people then, of course, never come back. And I shouldn't say many, because then I'll never get another visa again. Some don't come back, and of course, out goes a vote. But nonetheless, you've done a service. The book is based on very in-depth and intensive shadowing of a number of politicians across many states. Surprisingly, she didn't chase me, or she would have had first-hand experience of what I've written about. Next time, write a different book. You've done corruption, you've done constituent servicing, now you'll have to find something totally different, because I think you really have thoroughly examined the issue here. And she's done, you know, field experiment surveys, all of that stuff, interviews, analysis. Now, a couple of observations Jennifer makes: the uneven character of access to services at the local level, often due to biased allocation on the part of local intermediaries. That's probably true. In fact, that is true. And as a result, I mean, in my state, for example, there's such a partisan divide between communist supporters and Congress supporters that if a family is known to be a Congress voter, the CPM government will just not give them the below the poverty line BPL card to which they're entitled. And so you really have to fight for them, and often it doesn't succeed because they will find some excuse or the other to deny this family because it's known to have voted for the Congress or supported the Congress. This kind of thing happens a lot, and so they come obviously to the MP asking for help, and we do try and help. And it's very clear, as she says, that helping constituents to obtain public benefits is obviously of electoral benefit to us, and that's why we do it. And I don't think that, to that degree, Neerja's comment that politicians are selfish. I mean, if you're in a profession that requires you to have people's votes, you will do what you can, what you must, to win those votes. And some people do only the ethical things, and some people do anything in order to get those votes, and that's life, that's politics. And you know, in a country like India, and Jennifer is very good on this, the state is a very major provider. We've built up a state that is now gradually letting go of things. I mean, even today I got a request from a constituent for an upgrade on Air India. And this is the day in which we had a debate in Parliament about the privatization of Air India, and presumably when that happens, finally those requests will stop. We've built up a state where, to use her slightly academic language, there is a strong demand for informal routes to obtaining services and for interventions by influential intermediaries. Because basically you're helping your own voters, whether they voted for you or not, but your own constituents, to access benefits which the state is supposed to provide but often doesn't provide, simply or directly. And yes, it does help you build a positive reputation. I have no doubt that if I had not done this job, I wouldn't have been re-elected once, let alone twice. I have an exhausting time during Parliament sessions because I have a pretty full load and demand during Parliament. In fact, because I'm here now at 4 o'clock, I have been given a slot at 10 o'clock to speak on the demand for the railways, at 10 p.m. tonight, in order to speak on the demands for grants of the Railway Ministry. It's a very demanding week. And then Friday night, you're always on a plane, I'm always on a plane to Thiruvananthapuram, which is literally as far as you can fly without falling into the water. There is no farther airport in terms of miles, or kilometers, or whatever, from Delhi than my constituency. And I fly there, and then I spend all day Saturday and Sunday in essentially 16-hour days, 15-hour days. And then if I'm lucky, I catch an evening flight on Sunday, and most days I'm not lucky, so I end up having to wake up at 4 a.m. on Monday to catch a 6 a.m. flight to get here in time for Parliament Monday morning, and then the cycle starts again. So it is actually a very demanding thing, but that's essentially at bottom why I know I was re-elected. I mean, people have seen me, they've seen me attending to their needs, and that's why they vote for me. Whereas MPs, and particularly I've got to say in the north, who have a slightly different relationship with their constituencies and are much less frequently seen there, have a rougher time. They're the ones who perhaps can only win on Modi's name, and they do. And they have done this time. But the rest of us, what differentiates us is precisely the work we do in our own constituencies. So that's pretty much, I think, the main series of points that Jennifer has made. And her conclusion that politicians in patronage democracies devote a great deal of effort and time to providing services that constituents have reason to value seems self-evident, but yet it's actually, she goes beyond that to say that politicians are in many ways more responsive than we give credit for. And I think that's true. Having come from a middle-class, urban, professional background like most of the people in this room, I too share the instinctive bias most of you feel about the political class. But I realize that people like us, if I can use that phrase, since I used to be one of you, have absolutely no idea how hard politicians have to work and how intensely they have to work. This is a deeply demanding profession. It is often emotionally draining. It is very rarely intellectually satisfying, which is the frustration for someone like me, and why I turn to writing as my means of intellectual refuge, because most of the work that I've described to you all, I won't repeat it, as you can imagine, offers no satisfaction other than that of solving somebody's problem, which you may do in many cases, even most cases, but you will always sometimes fail to do. But you do it because, in fact, it's necessary to do. And that brings me to the last point, which I think Jennifer makes very clearly, that politicians are often dealing with these problems without addressing the larger issue of why the problem exists in the first place. So she says, for example, if a constituent is not getting her pension because the bureaucrat wants a bribe or whatever, and the Parliament MP leans heavily on the bureaucrat and gets the person the pension, that's all very well, but shouldn't that politician actually be working for a more responsive bureaucracy or means that prevent the rent seeker from coming between the recipient of a government benefit and the benefit itself? And she's quite right. I mean, she suggests slightly mischievously that usually politicians don't bring in any real policy or legislation to counteract the problem, because that would undermine the need for politicians to intercede, and so deprives them an opportunity to win voters' favors. Now that's, I think, a bit excessively cynical. Many of us would be grateful if these problems could be reduced and they wouldn't come to us with things that, frankly, none of us enjoys doing. But anyway, the fact is that she's right that mediation from above is an extremely important resource for all of us, and that it does, after all, help us get elected. So with those words, good luck to Jennifer. It's an excellent book, and I'm sure that it will be a valuable contribution to the literature, even if in the bibliography these two articles could usefully be added. Thank you very much. Jai.
Thank you very much, Shashi. Thank you. I'm sure they will be there in the next edition of the book. That's the thing with books, there's always another edition. With that, may I invite you, Kanchan, to make your comments?
So I'm really very happy to be here, and I want to thank first OUP and also Ashutosh for organizing this conclave, both because I think it's a very important intellectual event, but also because this combination, the fact that you have people in the room, politicians, journalists, lawyers, people who are not academics, is actually very, very important for the accountability of academic work. And so, for instance, to have an MP actually sort of remark on a book about MPs, among other sorts of legislators, I think that's actually a very, very important way to keep us honest. And I also want to thank our panelists, but also Jennifer particularly, for what is really a remarkable book. And I think one of the major contributions this book makes is a big picture interpretation of democracy in India, but also in a comparative framework, coupled with really a very, very fine-grained empirical picture of very specific interactions on the ground. And I think that combination of things makes it a very unusual, very remarkable book. And I'd urge you all to read it. I'm going to do three things in my remarks. First, I want to say a little about the contributions the book makes, then say something about the interpretation of the data, and then say a third thing about how I think this subject might be usefully studied in a second iteration. On the first point, on the contribution, so here there are, I think broadly, if you look at newspaper articles, but also certainly in the academic work on the subject, there are two dominant ways of looking at democracy in India. One is a patronage-based argument, which suggests that politics in India is really dominated by the exchange of state benefits for votes. And that, I mean, certainly my work has fallen in that tradition. And for those of you who were following this year's election, I think the clearest, boldest statement of this was from Maneka Gandhi in Sultanpur, who said to Muslims in Sultanpur, if you don't, I'm going to win anyway, but if you don't vote for me next time, if you come to me for work, I'll have to think about it. And she actually had a very specific quote. She said, "It's all a give and take, isn't it? We will see if the election results show 100 votes or 50 votes, and then we will see when you come to me for work." And Shashi said, of course, we can't really know how people voted, but she then went on to say, and it's not just Maneka Gandhi, many legislators I've interviewed say, in her case, she said, we're going to divide the villages. We have an ABCD formula. There are category A villages and category B villages, and we sort of, no, I understand, but Shashi, of course, is different. And so that, and so in her case, it was a very unusual, very bold statement of a practice which is actually quite common, whether or not politicians can actually monitor how people vote, sort of using the capacity to use discretion to influence the vote, and helping to create sort of an expectation that the vote is, that there's sort of some knowledge of how the votes take place. That's one way of looking at democracy in India. And then there's a second way, a second interpretation, and that I think has particularly acquired force in the last decade or so. And that is to say that politics in India is not or no longer about patronage or clientelism or essentially relationships with individual politicians, but it's about the performance of the government broadly and its ability to bring about development more broadly. So it really is about policies, or at a minimum about performance. And some of that, has acquired force, I think, particularly in the last decade, both because of the use of technology to circumvent what is seen as clientelism. So the Aadhaar, for instance, or creating bank accounts, trying to circumvent the middleman or the politician or the individual in the relationships between, or the way in which the state disburses at least funds to citizens. And then also, at least when it comes to the BJP, to a centralized notion of politics where the performance of the government is sort of closely associated with one person. And so I think sort of a centralized model of politics also maybe goes hand in hand with a more sort of delivery of benefits, or an interpretation of the delivery of benefits as something that is more collective and centralized, as opposed to something that depends on individual face-to-face relationships. And here too, there are lots of examples of this. So from the press, for So one voter who voted for Modi, for instance, explained her vote as saying this was for development. That her vote attached more importance to performance and development than to face-to-face interactions. And I think what Clients and Constituents, what Jennifer's book brings to, in a way, this very, you could say, a stylized debate, is open it up to say there is a third way of looking at politics in India, and there to highlight the importance of constituency service. And here, the important thing is it's not just the claim that politicians spend a lot of time attending to the needs of constituents, which they do, and which anyone who studies Indian politics would accept, but the key claim she makes is that this is non-contingent, that it is not contingent on the partisanship or the identity attributes or sort of promises voters make. It's not a give and take, it is give. And so here, Menka Gandhi said, we're not really this is not about Gandhi, we sort of give and we take. And I think Jennifer's argument is that it is in part actually about Gandhi. There is sort of a large chunk of what politicians do, which is service-oriented, which is not a quid pro quo. And I think this is actually a very important point. And here again, the argument is not that this notion of service or responsiveness replaces patronage, sort of argues that it's a complement to it, and it can actually be a solution sometimes to the politics of patronage by sort of creating a channel through which voters can obtain their entitlements when channels of patronage are actually blocked. And here, it's also a different way of looking at discretion. So one way to look at discretion, that is sort of the predominant way of looking at discretion, I think, in economics, and I think it's also true of my earlier work, the idea that discretion is a negative thing because it provides an opportunity for rent seeking. And I think what Jennifer's book points to is that discretion can also be a very humanizing thing. Maybe it provides opportunities for rent seeking, but it also provides opportunities for responsiveness and the injection of a certain kind of humane form of governance. And so these are sort of conceptual points that I think are actually very important. And I think I sort of agree with both Jennifer and with Shashi in the sense that this rethinking of the role of politicians is again sort of an important contribution of the book. And I see a quote Jennifer who says many politicians are less venal and more other regarding than political scientists may typically perceive them to be. And I think there really is, and that actually it's an empirical point which then leads to a theoretical rethinking of the role of politicians. I think that's again important. I will say I've spent now I'm old enough to say this, I've spent about 30 years interviewing politicians, among them MPs and MLAs. There is no MP or MLA who has ever said no. Ever. There's always, and you could say, well, you're sort of a professor, etc., but this is true now. This was true when I was a 20-year-old student. The only difference, and it did mean, their days started very early. During election time, they started even earlier. If a day was very packed, they would say, come at 6 o'clock, come before I go out for my campaign. If they were busy, they'd say, sit in the car. They'd have 3 minutes at a rally. But they didn't say no, and that was, I think, not just me. So there was just sort of a culture of not saying no. Whether they could actually respond to what someone wanted, that's a different story, but it's sort of a very accessible environment. Again, very long days, 16-hour days, sometimes longer. So here, when it comes to the contribution of the book, one is, I think, sort of a new interpretation of thinking about these face-to-face interactions. I think what Jennifer's book points to is very much an idea that, and I think this again sort of coincides with some of what Shashi said, that democracy in India is not, at least, not yet, maybe not at all, about collective benefits, sort of, that are institutionally delivered, or maybe not mainly, that face-to-face interactions are a critical aspect of how politics is conducted. So in I'm quoting from different parts of the book, when she interviews politicians, she sort of notes that about 2/3 of their time is spent in direct interactions with citizens. There are data she cites when it comes to citizens. If you just think about the numbers, she uses Transparency International data to say 6% of the Indian population reported contacting a politician directly for assistance within 1 year. And if you think about that, 6% of the population and sort of what percent of the population is adult and sort of able to vote, that's a huge number. In the state of Rajasthan, she cites another book, Gabby Crooks-Wisner, to saying 22% of the population reported it, sort of contacting a politician directly. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, 6%. These are very large numbers. And so I think I think what's very convincing in the book is this idea that face-to-face interactions are a critical aspect of the way democracy is conducted in India. And then the important innovation inclination is to say here, these face-to-face interactions, a very large chunk of them have to do, they are non-contingent in nature. They're not about an exchange, they are about service and responsiveness. The second thing, and here, others have alluded to this, is just the breadth of the data sources. I mean, the field experiment with all MPs and MLAs, which in my reading is really the most important. I think it's the heart of the book. But large-scale surveys with politicians, with citizens, with sample sizes of about 30,000, also bureaucrats, and then something that I think neither Jennifer nor Shashi touched upon, but I think is absolutely critical, is an attempt to locate India within the universe of democracies by actually collecting data, trying to classify democracies across the world as whether or not they are patronage-based. And what that does is, I think, given especially because Jennifer's work is on patronage and corruption, there is a danger when you write about patronage and corruption, especially on Indian democracy, that if you don't contextualize it with some sort of global comparisons, what you end up doing is unwittingly reifying a notion of democracy in the world where those democracies over in the East, they do things, they deal with corruption and patronage. It sort of unwittingly reifies a dichotomy with the idea that in Europe and the US, politics is about policy. And I think, but what that means is that actually it places a larger burden on the scholar to say, to sort of not repeatedly reinvent that dichotomy. And what she's able to do, especially in the last chapters, contextualize, is place India in that kind of global comparative framework. But she does that really throughout the book. And so that's also a very important contribution. It's a book that both delves deeply into Indian politics, but debunks that notion of, say, Indian exceptionalism in this dysfunctional sense. So that is, I think those are the three things I'll say about the contributions that I see as the contributions of the book. A conceptual move that has a new way of thinking about democracy in India, a great breadth of data sources, and the scale of the data work is actually remarkable, and then placing India in a comparative framework. The second point I want to make, and that has to do with the interpretation of the data. So having said all of these things, I want to spend some time particularly on the field experiment, which is of almost all MPs and MLAs in India, which is sort of a near census, which really is the heart of the book. It's the heart of the book because that's the experiment which shows that politicians are both responsive, but that this responsiveness is non-contingent in nature, that they're not responding to the individual attributes of those who reach out to them for help. Here I think, so the way the experiment, so it's about almost 4,000 MPs and MLAs, I think in the year 2016, is that right? And here what sort of Jennifer's teams did is they sent 6 text messages, they obtained the phone number of the MP or MLA from the net. They sent 6 messages either on text or WhatsApp to the politicians over a 15-day period of time. And then they looked at, and they varied, so that the experiment varied the identity of the person described in the text message, caste identity, partisan sort of support. And then they looked to see, did the politician respond or not? How many messages did they respond to? What did they say? And so now the thing is, of these, and because these were almost 4,000 MPs, each of whom was MPs and MLAs, who were sent 6 messages each, this means a total of about 24,000 messages. Now the thing is, the response rate was 11%. Right? So they really, all the MPs, and responding to a phone message sort of takes no time. But the total response rate was 11%. So when you look at that and say, what does this show us? Does it show us that legislators in India are responsive? Or does it tell us that they're not responsive? Is the glass half empty, half full? In this case, 9/10 empty or 1/10 full? And I'll say something about how to, so what this means for responsiveness, sort of the difference between responding to phone messages or face-to-face interactions. But now this responsiveness is just whether they responded at all. Did they respond in what Jennifer calls substantive responsiveness? Did they respond and say, okay, come see me, or give me a call? Did they sort of, in a way, open themselves up to being personally contacted? There are only 4% of these messages that received actually a substantive response, where they actually said, yes, come see me. And then the thing is, we actually don't know if, in this case, the two things that the goods they sought in these messages were a ration card or a street lamp. We actually don't, the responsiveness was just, did they respond to the phone message or not? But whether they actually got what they wanted, we actually have, whether that was non-contingent in nature. I think that is something that's sort of not actually clear in the book. There's sort of other pieces of evidence that suggest, that look at what happened to the actual requests. But those pieces of evidence don't emphasize this non-contingent nature. So now then the question becomes, who responded? And there's a great chapter that looks at the attributes of who responded. But the interesting thing is, among those who responded, opposition politicians, other things equal, were far more likely to respond than those who actually had state office. And opposition politicians were far more likely to respond in the years preceding an election. So really what it seems like, once they actually win, once the election is over, other things equal, they're less likely to respond. When they respond, it's only 11%. And of those 11, it's only 4% where they actually say, come see me. And then we don't know if something is actually done, So then the question becomes, what do these data show? Do they demonstrate responsiveness and service, or do they actually demonstrate a lack of it? And here, this comes to the third point. And here, I think also from both the data the book has on the face-to-face interactions, I think a lot of what Shashi has said, a lot of what I've observed, I do think that there is a level of responsiveness here and service that is in a way belied by these data on phone responses. So when I look at these data, I don't think this shows a lack of responsiveness. I think it's also a question of channel. What kind of responsiveness do you get through phone or WhatsApp? What kind of responsiveness do you get when it comes to face-to-face interactions? It is quite remarkable if politicians are spending 2/3 of their time in direct interactions with citizens, then maybe that's the way people get their work done as opposed to phone or WhatsApp. One way of reading these data is to say, let's think about channels of responsiveness. We know that WhatsApp, social media, phone messages have become a very, very important channel of campaigning. But maybe the conclusion to draw from these data is that those new channels are more important for disseminating information, but not for actually sort of acquiring responsiveness. Maybe the face-to-face interactions are still the way to actually get your work done. But then there are other aspects here, so one question about, is the key thing here, I think, to demonstrate is that these interactions are non-transactional, non-contingent in nature. Here, one of the things I was very curious about is, as Shashi said, when someone comes to your waiting room, they're not turned away. But of course, one wants to know who comes, who goes where. Are all MPs and MLAs sort of equally likely to be contacted by all social groups in the constituency? Is there a kind of sorting? Do some groups end up in some offices and not? That's one sort of possibility. Another is when you think about, say, even something like a ration card, and I know there are politicians here, there are bureaucrats here, some of whom I've actually worked with on this. So if you take a ration card, you can go to the MP or MLA to have your ration, to sort of try and get help with the ration card. But the ration card is one piece of paper, but to acquire that piece of paper, you need many other pieces of paper. So in the one case I'm thinking of, the ration card, in order to get that, the person who needed it required a certificate of residence. In order to get the certificate of residence, he required either his rental or electricity bill or a certificate from the landlord to say he was a tenant. In order to get the certificate from the landlord needed another piece of paper that demonstrated his secure sort of ownership of the building. In order then to demonstrate that he actually lived in this building, he required a no objection certificate or some sort of certificate from the local sort of the low level sort of a very junior position in the bureaucracy. And so here, even if the MP or MLA wanted to make a phone call, it wasn't actually in their power. You can exert a certain amount of pressure, but you have to win the compliance of people all the way down, including the local, sometimes the sarpanch or the parliament secretary. And so here again, the question becomes, what is, even so, MPs or MLAs can respond, but is their response an actual is it a way to correct channels of patronage being blocked at the bottom? Or do these different channels, do these different levels of politics and these different channels have to actually work together? And here I'm almost at the end of my remarks, but here I think the absolutely critical thing is, how do you get at these How do you get at, in a way, the sort of the key point of the book, these are non-contingent exchanges. I think the challenge of the book is to combine the kind of large-scale survey research that has been done for it, which is really, it makes the book stand out, with ethnography. So there is politician shadowing in the book, for instance, and I think here's the dilemma Jennifer faces. This is the kind of book that could not have been written 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, just because of the scale of the data required, So field experiment with 4,000 politicians, citizen surveys with 30,000 citizens, and that's just one of the many surveys used in the book, shadowing of multiple legislators across multiple states. This is the kind of work it's important to do it on that scale, but you cannot do it on that scale without delegating. And so a lot of this work, but including the shadowing, has been delegated through teams. And I think this kind of delegation is happening both in political science and in anthropology. But when you delegate at that level, you also then lose the ability you actually don't lose it, but I think part of the difficulty, part of what is happening, certainly in political science, but also in some branches of anthropology where I see that kind of delegation, is you then you focus on what the data produce, but you don't look at the data generating process. So how exactly, if a ration card is being asked for, what are the different levels in the chain that produce that result? What is the parliamentary secretary doing? What is the politician doing? Who shows up in these waiting rooms? If you have teams of researchers who, it's not just are the data being sent to us accurate, but you could say, what is the selection process? What are the biases in the process that actually generate the data? So, and I think what I'm advocating here is not so much a collaboration between anthropologists and political science, but an injection of anthropological insights into both the new kind of political science, but also into the new kind of anthropology. And I think without that, you actually don't have, I think what you have here is a demonstration that face-to-face interactions are very important, that politicians spend an inordinate amount of their time doing the work of constituents. What I think you don't yet have is a demonstration that these interactions are non-contingent. I also do think, and Shashi said Jennifer should do a different book in the third iteration, but Jennifer is also unusual in she has a degree in both political science and anthropology. So I do think that if someone aims for this kind of synthesis, she's the person to do it. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Kanchan, for these rich comments. Thank you. Yamini.
Thank you. The challenge of being literally the last speaker of the day is not only that all of you are probably exhausted, but also that almost all that has to be said has been said. But the advantage of being the last speaker is that in all the things that have been said, some new ideas get sparked. And one of the things that listening to Shashi and reflecting on everything I learned from reading Jennifer's book reminded me of something quite fundamental to the nature of our democracy that I feel we simply do not talk about enough, which is its sheer size. The size of our constituencies, and Jennifer, you talk about this, and Shashi, as he was describing his day, which exhausted me from just listening, so I can't imagine how you're able to stand up and talk. It's exactly, but your constituency, Trivandrum, or Thiruvananthapuram, is a much more handleable physical, geographical space. Think about rural constituencies.
Mine is 60% rural. I have tribals, I have coastal areas.
I only think of the city of Thiruvananthapuram and the beautiful Kovalam coast. All right, but even so, I think the scale of the geographical scale and scope of your constituency is relatively smaller compared to many others. And over time, as we have reduced the number of days of election campaigning to 3 weeks in an attempt to address Millen's problem of criminals in our politics and too much money floating around, I think the implications of all of this on how politicians behave is something that we don't talk about enough and that we don't fully understand. And to me, it also raises a very fundamental question that I think is the most important governance challenge that democracy in India has. And again, I don't think we talk about it enough, which is the question of what level of our federal architecture should be doing or performing what function. Much as the reality of our politics politics is that a member of parliament like Shashi is spending all his time trying to ensure visas for his constituents, and important as a role that might be, the fact is, as he himself says, his role is that of making policy and debating legislation in parliament. The role of a member of legislative assembly is to do something similar at the state level. In fact, they do even less of it and are almost too proud of it. And then there's the local governments, who are in fact the ones that are supposed to perform that critical mediation function of ensuring that core services to citizens are given. If you look at the data that Jennifer, you give us in your book, a lot of what high-level politicians, as you describe them, are doing is about income certificates, caste certificates, the everyday individual in fact, you make an important distinction between the individual services versus the sort of, I forgot the word you used, but the group, the group-oriented public services. So, you know, the most amount of time, and in fact, the most successful form of services are about these individualized services that members of parliament and members of legislative assemblies are providing to their constituents, whereas this should be and ought to be the core function of local governments. Now, Jennifer, you do have a very broad theoretical framing for why this does not happen. But I think, in fact, your story of blocking and why it is that constituents go from their panchayat office all the way up to the member of parliament makes, for me in my reading, a much more stronger case for more decentralization and more accountability through decentralization rather than less, and I'll come to that in the course of my remarks. But I do want to reiterate that I think I don't know what we can do about it, but the sheer size and the number of people that a member of parliament, a member of the legislative assembly represents does have implications on how the interpretation of representation and the practice of representation unfolds in our democracy, and it's something that we should bring into debates on democracy and the practice of democracy in India. Jennifer, when I was reading your book, actually, I found so much of your book so empowering because often when you read about democracy and our current experiences with democracy, as Neerja said, it leaves one somewhat despondent. And even though I fundamentally do not believe that politicians are only venal and corrupt and in it for selfish motives, I think there is some element of public service hidden there. Otherwise, no one would commit themselves to the kind of life that Shashi describes. But we haven't been able to find the right kind of framework within which to understand, articulate, and engage with the experience of representation in democracy in India. And I think your framing really helps. And in your framing, it also helped me think about some elements of accountability. A lot of my work has been on understanding the practice of accountability from the perspective of citizen claim making for welfare services. And there have been elements of that have been bothering me, and I hadn't quite found the vocabulary to articulate it. And I think from reading your book, I began to understand it somewhat better. So I thought I'll restrict my remarks, even though they do overlap a little bit with what both Shashi and Kanchan have said, to how your work has helped me think a little more about the normative framework of accountability and the practice of accountability in India. I think the first point I want to make is what I learned from your book, and I've always intuitively, I think, known, but the deep data that you give us allows us to empirically articulate this, is that the role that politicians are playing is very much that of being mediators between citizens and the bureaucracy. The state is not one monolith. There are politicians, there are bureaucrats, and then there are different types of politicians and different types of bureaucrats. And when you think about exactly the same kind of petitioning that takes place with MPs, MLAs, and sarpanches, for someone like me and many of us here who spent hours and hours and hours in district offices, block offices, you see exactly the same thing. The average Indian citizen spends an inordinate amount of time petitioning. In fact, I was quite curious, and I don't know if your survey data can answer this question. Is the first point of petition the bureaucrat, or is the first point of petition the politician? I'm curious, because when one of the big jobs of a district magistrate or district collector is in fact the grievance redressal role, and Anandita is sitting here who's been studying this to quite a degree. But the bureaucracy in India is, by virtue of its heritage, very distanced from citizens. So even when the Babu goes to the village in the Lal Batti Gadi. That's the sign of status, and that continues to today. Politicians, by definition, have to interact with people. So when politicians go to villages, even if they are arrogant or want to be distanced, they have to have a conversation. So the physical act of handing over that parchi, the physical act of handing over that petition, makes the politician and citizen shape a very unique kind of relationship in a way that the bureaucrat that is perhaps performing a similar task simply is unable to. And I think that has framed very much how we have tried to practice accountability when it comes to ensuring that the state delivers better to citizens. The practice of accountability, I think, has unfolded in two very different ways, but with exactly the same objective. How do you push the bureaucrat to do their job better, or how do you bypass the bureaucrat? Because in this articulation, the bureaucrat is the primary problem. And there are two different ways in which this has unfolded. There has been, and the UPA was sort of politically pushing this over the 10 years, the rights movement, which saw which sort of articulated accountability very differently, as citizens actively playing a role in claim making. But the primary focus, if you look at the details of how the rights movement articulated itself in its laws and schemes, was about the bureaucrat. In fact, the right to information very clearly is largely about bureaucratic transparency of the bureaucratic system, much less about the political system. And every time there's been an attempt to try and use the right to information for political parties, it has created its own forms of roadblocks. The other form of accountability has been the adoption of technology, which I think there is universal political party consensus on. Kanchan talked about Aadhaar and its centralizing elements. But the idea of technology is also similar. How do you ensure that front line of the bureaucracy is either gotten rid of or made to function better, without actually trying to engage with what is it that will actually take the frontline bureaucrat to deliver the job? Because ultimately, even the politician is calling up the BDO and saying, this is what you do. And in my work, where I've mostly been studying the BDO and the line department officials at the district level, we found that exactly the way politicians are getting inundated with requests from citizens, the BDO and the district collector and the line department officers are getting inundated by calls from politicians to try and get things done, because ultimately it is the patwari, it is the block development officer, it is the BEO, it is the Anganwadi worker that is charged with delivering the service. So I think what this constituency service dynamic has done in terms of how we understand the practice of accountability is that it has made us view the front line as the core part of the problem that either needs to pressurize to perform, or needs to be gotten rid of through technology, so you just directly deliver services to citizens. By the way, keeping a discretionary element very nicely, even with technology for politicians. It has also shaped, I think, the way in which we have articulated what citizen claim making should actually look like. And that is very much in the framework of petitioning. Which I think has made the practice of accountability very extractive. In fact, I would argue that accountability in Indian democracy is not so much constrained accountability, but extractive accountability, where in some senses the onus is on citizens to through the process of petitioning, extract accountability of the state. And this sort of links back to something that that many of the activists of the rights movements articulated when I asked them, why is it that many of the rights laws are so detailed? So if you look at the rights laws, they will tell you step by step, how is the right to information practiced? It is practiced by putting in an application. The public information officer gives you a parchi. Then in 30 days, you have to get a response. It's all about a set of very clearly defined actions that the state has to do. And the response I got was, if I don't have a clearly defined entitlement, then what is it and how is it that I can hold the state to account? So our understanding of accountability is very much about being able to have a very clear set of articulated relationships between the state and citizens, in which very clearly the process of petitioning can move slowly, step by step, all the way through the system for accountability to be realized. Now, in and of itself, itself, there's nothing wrong with this. But I think it limits our understanding of accountability as an extractive process and less as a process of norm building and shaping organizational behavior that will ensure that a system that should work actually works. And I think that that's where a lot of what you say, Jennifer, also about how the incentive structure of the citizen, the constituency service responsiveness does to the larger question of reform of the public service delivery system plays in. The last thing I wanted to say was on the decentralization story. I think that, in the end, going back to where I began, for a country as large as ours and for a country as diverse as ours, having a centralized political system and a centralized administrative architecture is simply not viable, whatever else we can argue about in terms of first principles. But, in fact, whenever we talk about local governance, the point at which we always get stuck is on this question of patronage and corruption. And what I saw in your narrative actually is a very interesting way out, because in fact, citizens' relationship with the state and with the political actors that represent the state isn't just limited to the panchayat. They are able to access the MLA, they are able to access the MP. So in fact, that may serve as a check and balance for venal behavior of the local government, rather than as a reason why we should not decentralize. So for this reason, I found, in fact, a lot of what you're saying served to further my argument, rather than, as you described, say that perhaps this means that there are limits to decentralization. So I'll stop there, but thank you for an absolutely fascinating book that has helped me think much more clearly about some of the issues that have been bothering me. Thanks.
Thanks, Yamini, so much. Now I need to negotiate with Ashu for a little bit of time so that Jennifer can respond. We've overshot, I know, the time for our session hugely, but if Jennifer can be given a few minutes to respond, could we extend till 5:30? Perfect, thanks so much. There might be questions for you, as long as you can.
Yeah, I could take a couple of questions that are meant for me, and then I will have to disappear.
Should we do that first then? Jennifer, you respond later? Okay. Go ahead, please. Yeah. No, the gentleman at the back in pink, in the pink shirt. Please use a mic and please introduce yourself.
I have a 5:30 commitment. I was supposed to leave at
Good evening.
5:15.
It's Rajesh from Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. My question to the panel that is this patronage service is going to make the public services or institutional dysfunctional in the process, or it will help out to take out this very dysfunctionality and corruption, whatever is said about the system? Thank you.
Well, my answer would simply be that that's not the case. To begin with, there's nothing preventing you guys from reforming your services. Because then you give us a good reason. I'll give you one example. Now, pretty much most government positions, as I told you, the bulk of the demands are for jobs, right? Now, most government positions require a computer-graded written examination, which cannot be rigged. So we can say truthfully to the constituent, listen, you have to pass this exam. There's nothing I can do to help you because the computer is grading it. Nobody I speak to can influence your marks there. Then, of course, follows the interview. And there you are supposed to use your influence, talk to the boss of the company and say, can you help this guy? I usually tend to say, look, other things being equal, would you regard this candidate sympathetically? I never go beyond that because I'm also aware of the moral hazard involved in essentially, because somebody came to see me, that guy, I put pressure on an MD of a public sector corporation to give someone a job who may not deserve it as much as some person who didn't try to use influence and was there on his own merit. So I always say, just look at this person sympathetically, but of course, I never encourage anyone to go beyond merit. I can't speak for other MPs and MLAs, they may well do so. But there you have an example of a system being created that reduces the danger of discretion. So if a written exam is 80% of the value and the interview is 20, very, very often it's 60-40 actually. But in any case, in those circumstances, you're already reducing the level of influence. At least the person who won't pass the written exam will not even get to the stage where influence works for him. You see what I'm saying? So systems and institutions can remedy their own methods of doing things, number one. And number two, where there is discretion, one should also count on the recipient of the call to have the strength of conviction or character to be able to say, sir, I've got your message. And indeed, if the person otherwise qualifies in merit, the fact that you have recommended him will weigh in my mind, but I have to look at the other candidates equally, and I would respect the person for saying that to me.
If there's any other question for Mr. Tharoor?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I really have to leave. I was supposed to have left 5 minutes ago.
If there's
for
a question
5:30
for
committee.
anyone else on the panel, we'll take it in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Shashi, what is the answer to the question that was posed? If MPs and MLAs are so flooded with individual requests from their constituency,
Yeah.
why won't parliamentarians or MLAs think of a reform of bureaucracy so that it becomes more responsive and the demands on you go down?
Well, I've already quoted Jennifer's answer, right? She says that
What is your
politicians have no vested interest in reforming the bureaucracy because that will deprive them of this role. I think I said that's a bit cynical because...
But you said, you seem to disagree with that claim.
Yeah,
No.
I disagree with that because of course the bureaucracy can be reformed, but no individual MP or MLA can do it, right? It's the government of the day can certainly introduce state reforms, and this example I gave of an examination is one example of institutional reform. But the problem is the system is very deeply entrenched, and some would argue it's not just from the British days, it may even in North India be from the Mughal days. Certain habits of bureaucracy are so deeply ingrained in our culture. I would recommend for all of you a hilarious 1860 thereabouts book called The Chronicles of Bajpur, written by an Englishman. You've got it. So I wish it was out of print, and I had to read a borrowed copy which I had to return.
There is a digital copy of it available on the net.
Okay, so The Chronicles of Bajpur is a very biased Englishman's account, but hilariously written, of the perils of Mufassal administration in colonial India. And of course, he blames all the bad habits on things that existed before the British came. So that's how deeply entrenched the bureaucratic culture is. Now, let me just add one more thing, because that really is the other problem we have, which is that the voting public do not understand the difference between a councillor's job or a panchayat member's job at the lowest level, an MLA and an MP. They will come to all three levels with the same problem, and very often they will come to the highest level, that is the MP, assuming that what an MLA can't solve, an MP can solve. And therefore the burden, first of all, just trying to explain to people that honestly, this is not my job. I'm supposed to be influencing, if anything, benefits for the constituency from Delhi, from the ministries in Delhi. That's my job. If I spend all my time doing these, worrying about potholes on the road, which is the municipal corporation's business, or street lights that may or may not be working, and trash collection and all of those issues. But they all come to me. All these issues come to me, and I'm very often judged. People will criticize, what kind of MP are you? There's trash piling up on the side of the road, and I have to explain, I have absolutely no responsibility for that, but because I am seen as the people's representative, I am at least speaking out about it or trying to use some influence. But I neither have authority nor budget. A state government, on the other hand, could intercede with the municipal corporation, give them more money from the state budget to clean up their trash. I can ask the urban development minister in Delhi for additional money, which may or may not work. When my own party was in power, I was able to do things like that. Now that my party is not in power, I doubt very much, frankly, that I will get any additional benefits. In any case, they can always retreat, and this government is particularly talented at retreating behind the excuse, no, we can't respond to individual MP requests like this, let the request come from the state government. Knowing full well that in my state, the state government is also hostile to my party, so neither way am I able to get what my constituents are clamoring for. But all I'm saying is, because the public doesn't understand, they see all three levels as extractive intermediaries sort of tugging at the memories of the welfare state, to you quote Upamanyu's famous phrase. And that is essentially what we find ourselves doing the bulk of the time. But that doesn't mean we can afford to ignore our real work in Parliament, because we come back and do that too, and do it to the best of our ability, and often don't get much sleep as a result.
Can you hear me? Thank you. I'll get back to you in a moment. And so to add on to the question, Shashi, this is for you, but on Ashu's point of his, can there not be a reform of the bureaucracy? If you look at the last 10 years, there have been at least 15 years, at least 4 attempts at reform. Short term, nothing, not by changing the constitution, but one is by instituting these Janta Darbars, which now happens in every state. Every bureaucrat, every district magistrate has to, but also the lower levels, all the way down, they have to hold these public sort of courts, darbars. That's one. The second is the Right to Information Act. So now, Jennifer could do her experiment because now you can actually get phone numbers, you can get the forms, you have to get the instructions, and the implementation is variable, but now you get information on which there was itself a premium 10 years ago. For something like Narega, there are audits built into the system. Then you have for jobs, including things like a police constable, now there's more of an attempt to rationalize the criteria. Maybe it just reshuffles. But what I mean is there have been these attempts at reform. Could you talk about their effect or the lack of it?
Can I just add to, because in fact, I think part of the reason why there isn't any serious attempt at administrative reform is precisely because this constituency service kind of relationship has shaped our understanding as citizens of what our relationship of accountability should be like. And so a lot of this is about petitioning for specific things and the expectation of those specific things to be delivered. And that has been also the way in which the accountability movements have unfolded, rather than a more robust conversation on administrative reforms. Where it has been about trying to get the bureaucrats out of the way, rather than trying to fix the system so that the system can actually function and do its job.
I have to agree with you. That is, in fact, the case. Kanchan is right that some of these things are happening. In RTI, which obviously my government brought in, we're very proud of, has made something of a difference, except the BJP has been very successful in hollowing out the effectiveness of RTI by simply failing to appoint commissioners. So there's some appallingly high, 78% vacancy rate or something. If you don't appoint commissioners, you can't get answers. And so the last time I checked, it was something like 240,000 pending piled up RTI applications. So you hollow out the impact of the law. When we were there and we appointed serious citizen activists like Sailesh Gandhi and so on to these jobs, who took RTI seriously and used it to challenge the government effectively, then we were responsive. This government, the BJP government, is not and has no particular intention of being. And the fact that they can get away with it, despite the law on the books, is unfortunately a sad indictment of the system. I think we'll fall back by default to what Yamini said. You see, the expectations have been conditioned by 70 years, that people will keep expecting the state to provide these favors, and MPs and MLAs knowing full well that they're going to be judged electorally by their responsiveness to these, will never just put up their hands and say, sorry, I'm here to do something else. That's the great blessing of being in the Rajya Sabha. Because once you get to the Rajya Sabha, you can wash your hands of all of these headaches. And suddenly your mind is free to think and write and so on. Unfortunately, I haven't had that luxury. So I look at it with occasional envy. But there's no question that the amount of clout and credibility that comes from being an elected MP vastly outweighs anything you can get from being in the upper house. So that's broadly, plus on top of that, the upper house depends very much on the whims and fancies of the leadership of the party, whereas the lower house depends on your ability to get elected. Of course, you could be denied a ticket, that's a different story. But once you have the ticket, thereafter, a lot of your individual abilities come into play. And that's, again, a useful testing ground for what you want to do in politics. But you're right, there have been some useful improvements. But Yamini is right that the public, the overall political system in India is conditioned to a certain understanding. By the way, I should have mentioned this. Jennifer hasn't particularly, I didn't notice it in Jennifer's book, that a hell of a lot, I would argue a majority of the things that we are asked to do, an American congressman would be not able to do because of the prevailing ethical standards. That it would not be appropriate for a congressman to intervene, for example, a job application, seek a transfer, any of these things. And I remember a conversation with a congressman already now some years ago, in which he said, can't do this. How can you do it? And I said, well, if I don't do it, I don't get elected. If you do it, you might get into legal trouble. That's the difference in our systems. And that's the irony. They have provided by the US government big offices, large staffs, all paid for and everything. We get nothing. We get a token amount of money, which everyone knows, including the people who are allocating that money, would not even be enough to cover 10% of our costs in running a constituency office and a Parliament Delhi office and paying 2 sets of staff and maintaining 2 sets of establishments. But we do it. I suppose some are forced to do it through underhand means. Most of us essentially subsidize our political life by our earnings elsewhere. In order to be able precisely to pay 2 sets of salaries and 2 sets of electricity bills and 2 sets of office places. Yeah, I know I've got to go. But just to say, Ashutosh, the fact is that that ethical question has not been addressed either. And it's an important one because the things that we openly do, forget all the underhanded corruption stuff that was the subject of Jennifer's first book. The things we openly do in India and are expected of us would be considered unethical in many modern Western democracies.
So very much. Thank you. Is there one more for Mr. Tharoor? Okay, go ahead.
We're running out of time. Then maybe we should just take the lady and then go because her hand's been up for a long time. Is that for me?
Good answer because it's a question I'm curious about and
I'm so sorry we couldn't hear you.
Okay, so my question is, it sort of builds on what both Yamini and Kanchan said, which is that over 15 states now have right to public service laws, and a question that's been not bothering me, it's something I'm curious about, is where is the political incentive to pass these laws coming from? Because these have all passed in legislative assemblies across the country, and if it has passed, it is trying to systematize this, shikayat and avedan culture and create a bureaucratic system whereby these avedans are dealt with in a transparent and accountable manner. So where are the political incentives if it then disrupts the relationship between politicians and their constituents? And then in that case, Jennifer, this is a question for you. Does it really disrupt or does it reinforce the argument sort of that you're making in your book and to some extent that you addressed in your first book, where RTPS laws are central, sort of key cases that you look at? So if both of you could answer.
I'll leave this to the scholars to reply because I haven't had much experience with this in the Kerala situation. But I can say that generally speaking, the pressure for citizens' rights legislation, that is legislation that officially makes government more transparent and accountable, has been there and mounting mainly from NGOs and civil society organizations, not from politicians. But we have to be responsive to some degree because on what basis can we say, no, we don't want to do this? And that's why it's happening. Don't assume that everything is initiated by politicians. Indeed, much of legislation that governments present are actually initiated by bureaucrats who draft these laws, and they are often much more receptive to and attentive to civil society movements, NGO movements, the media, and so on, than we commonly give them credit for. I mean, the bureaucracy has a lot of sins to answer for, but they're not totally impervious to the demands of a society from which they themselves have emerged as a class. Thank you very much, and apologies for abandoning ship, but I'm late.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah, oh, good.
Sorry about this.